Now, last but by no means least, we are welcoming Sam Gruber.
This talk is going to be something quite different because it's going to deal with probably a work most of you are not aware of. It's also going to deal with something that is very big, something that is essentially architectural and not on paper, something that is a work and represents Szyk's interest in the post-war period, and also touches on several of my areas of research, which is American synagogue art and architecture, and Holocaust commemoration, particularly Holocaust memorial monuments. I, like many of the other speakers, am not a Szyk expert. I have used a half dozen Szyk images in my classes over the years. I teach a class every so often at Syracuse called the Holocaust Memory in the Visual Arts. And I usually mix it up with images from Theodore Geisel and Charlie Chaplin, and we look at Jojo Rabbit, and we do different things. But we don't go deep into Szyk's career, into the many facets of his life and his work. So this has been a real education for me to attend this conference, and so many questions, so many opportunities for further research are there. All right, so that's the Forest Hills Jewish Center. Okay, so the news of the demolition of this building and the uncertain future of the Ark has sparked a flurry of activity among Judaic curators and scholars who, along with the congregation, are searching for a way to save the Ark. I was alerted to this by my friend Simone Di Nepi, who's the curator of Judaica at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. She said, Sam, what are we going to do about this? Because part of what I do is try to save old synagogues, and right now we're moving a mural, for instance, from Western Massachusetts to the Yiddish Book Center, hopefully, and the same thing might be done for this Ark. Okay, so Szyk's Ark is an unusual work of American Jewish art. It recalls past traditions, but was entirely unexpected and unique in the world of post-World War II synagogue art and architecture. As I said, it's 30 feet tall, but because of the large size of the sanctuary, it doesn't overwhelm the space. It is constructed from cast and painted plaster with bronze arch doors, adjacent bronze menorahs, and an intricately designed bronze ner tamid, that's the eternal light. An inner wooden grill hides the choir loft. And, okay, wait, did I go too far? Okay, so there's the Ark detail. And then an inner wooden grill hides a choir loft, the openwork designs of which recalls traditional Jewish paper cuts. And by the way, I was fascinated by an image I haven't seen before, the second image that Ellen showed of Pharaoh's daughter retrieving Moses, because the border of that was all done like a traditional Jewish paper cut, but inserted are the signs of the 12 tribes, and we'll look at those same signs later on in this presentation. And by the way, so there's a paper cut. This one happens to be done in the in the early 20th century. It's in honor of my great-grandfather as one of the founders of the Synagogue of B'nai Abraham in Brenham, Texas, but that's a totally different lecture. But I thought you'd like to see the lions. I'll be teaching in 2 weeks, Ellen. I'll be speaking about this when in Houston. So Rabbi Ben Zion Boxer commissioned the Ark, and he described it as a giant Torah breastplate or shield, and this is just a comparison. Some of you know that very ornate one in the Jewish Museum. Its flowing and expansive form also recalls the traditional depiction of curtains or drapery painted on an ark wall, and I've written about synagogues curtains before, and you can find that online. Though three-dimensional, Szyk's original drawings indicate how this architectural form and the associated menorahs and ner tamid were essentially conceived of as a two-dimensional design. And these are just some details of the drawings. These are my photos, but Susan Freeman also publishes some of these in her 2020 article. So after the Second World War, the Forest Hills Jewish Center board and rabbi began planning a larger synagogue complex. The old building no longer met the congregation's needs or the expected growth due to the return of servicemen from the war and the anticipated baby boom. This wasn't unusual. Most synagogue construction in America had stopped during the Great Depression and World War II. The end of the war, however, released the energy and eventually the funds and physical materials to launch a post-war building boom for Jewish communities nationwide. New buildings took place on the edge of American post-war optimism and the Jewish void of horrific loss of life and communities in the Holocaust. Congregations and some architects struggled to bridge these tremendous forces. The new Jewish Center was designed by Joseph Furman in a seemingly simple and sleek style that continued modernist architectural trends of the 1930s, essentially Art Deco, Art Moderne. It has an exterior of reddish stone, brick facing, and limestone trim. The cornerstone was set in 1947, and the synagogue and ark were dedicated on September 18th, 1949, in the presence of local dignitaries, including New York Mayor William O'Dwyer. The architecture of the building is not widely known, despite its being one of the first post-war synagogues completed and one of the first entirely modern American synagogues. The Ark has been ignored in most literature about post-war synagogue art and architecture, including my own book and including Gavro's Feld's book. The Ark, it was mentioned only in passing by scholars of Szyk's life and art until a detailed article, as I mentioned, by Susan Freeman, that was published in 2020. Rachel Vishnitzer mentioned the Ark briefly in her essential 1955 work on American synagogues, but she did not describe or illustrate it. She implied that the Ark was meant to add spiritual content, color, and I'm quoting, spiritual content, color, and emotional stimulation to the otherwise, quote, plain lines of Furman's design. This conflict with the plainness of modernism also led to the addition in the sanctuary of colorful stained glass windows designed by Jean-Jacques Duval in the 1960s. In 1951, Stephen Kaiser, then curator of New York's Jewish Museum, wrote of the center that, quote, the artist's general inclination is toward renewal of certain picturesque features in Jewish pictorial art, whose thinking is much more in terms of minute details than in monumental structures. The result, no matter how the Aron itself is judged, is a clash between the straight tectonic character of the synagogue itself and the picturesque and unplayful style of the Ark, unquote. One of the many characteristics that sets the Szyk art apart from other arcs of the period is its abundant use of curved lines in almost every part, whereas most arcs of the post-war decades are composed with straight lines and angles, as we'll see later. In 1949, let's see, am I supposed to use this or the computer arrows? Doesn't matter? Okay. Yeah. In 1949, it was still imaginable that new synagogue designs might favor traditional motifs, though at the time of the creation of the Szyk ark, the ornate arcs of, the ornate arcs of Eastern Europe were little known in the English-speaking world. Eastern European synagogues were not much illustrated in the few English-language articles and books about synagogue history and art. The most active Jewish architects who had fled to America, including Eric Mendelsohn, Fritz Natan, and David Moed, were avowed modernists, as were the prominent younger American architects Sigmund Braverman and Percival Goodman, who were yet to make their mark. Here we go. Mendelsohn practiced an expressive modernism that did allow for some soaring curves, as you see here in his B'nai Amunah at St. Louis and Park Synagogue in Cleveland, but he eschewed the intricate formal patterns and decorative detail central to Szyk's art. Earlier in the century, a few small immigrant synagogues had created large two-story arcs that sometimes crowded their small worship spaces, but these tended to incorporate Gothic and classical design elements already prevalent in American religious architecture. Just here are two examples. In the New York's Lower East Side congregation of Adas Yisrael Anshe Mezerich, which has since been destroyed on East 6th Street, it was a small space dominated by a big Gothic-inspired arc. And in New England, where many immigrant communities employed the services of immigrant cabinet maker Sam Katz, the classical style was favored. Only in the large ark in New York's Bialystoker Synagogue, only New York's Bialystoker Synagogue ark deviated from this pattern. The date and place of the origin of the ark are unknown, and it has been claimed that it was carved in either Italy or Poland and shipped to New York. Regardless, it is the closest Americans could get to the style and content of a traditional Polish wooden ark. While Szyk's ark is in that tradition, it more closely resembles the arks of masonry synagogues, such as those that can still be seen in the partially preserved 18th century synagogue in Tokocin, Poland, which I showed before with the drapery. The Forest Hills Ark was commissioned by Rabbi Bukser, a native of Lubomel in Poland, which is now in Ukraine, which was famous for its massive so-called fortress synagogue. Bukser and Szyk had become friends in 1941, shortly after Szyk's arrival in New York, when they were introduced by lithographer and congregant Herman Jaffe. Szyk had his first American exhibition at the Forest Hills Jewish Center, where 56 paintings and illuminations, including his Agada, were exhibited there in February 1941, so soon after his arrival. Various works of his subsequently appeared in the synagogue newsletter. And then when Szyk died 10 years later, he was buried in the Forest Hills Jewish Center grounds at the new Montefiore Cemetery. Freeman quotes Bukser's important Kol Nidre message of 1945, in which the rabbi desires that the new building stand as, quote, a memorial to those historic synagogues that perished in the flames of Nazi vandalism, but whose spirit lives on and must find in us a new vindication. And these are just various ruined synagogues that I've photographed over the years in Eastern Europe, and there are many more, of course. Szyk, whose work was steeped in Jewish history, had gained American fame for his anti-Nazi cartooning, as we've talked about. He was sympathetic to Bukser's view. The Ark, dedicated in September 1949, was a fulfillment of the rabbi's vision. With its traditional forms and explicit Jewish iconography, it was independent of and even a corrective to the stylish but austere modern synagogue in which it was installed. Much more than the building itself, it is a conscious evocation of the destroyed synagogues of Eastern Europe. The Forest Hills congregation was not alone in incorporating memorial elements in new synagogue design. About the same time, architect Percival Goodman included a stone from the destroyed synagogue in Mannheim, Germany, as a Holocaust memorial at Congregation B'nai Israel in Millburn, New Jersey, where Max Grunwald, a refugee from Germany, was the rabbi. Sculptor Herbert Ferber created an exterior relief titled, "And the Bush Was Not Consumed," a subject proposed by Rabbi Grunwald, who had been instrumental in encouraging the inclusion of contemporary art in the new building. Grunwald stated, "The burning bush burned but was never consumed, which reflects the fate of our people." These synagogue commemorations, and possibly others, went forward on a congregational level, while the efforts for a large public communal monument planned for Riverside Park in New York were stalled and then entirely stymied. As apparent in this exhibition, Szyk is best known for his work in miniature, illuminated manuscripts, book illustrations, political cartoons, etc. The scope of his work expanded, however, following World War II, due to the notoriety he had attained with Jews in America for his prolific, unflinching, and continuous work as an anti-Nazi political cartoonist, and his explicit attention to the plight of European Jews. His war work and his Zionism brought him into close contact with many prominent Jewish American leaders. In 1946, shortly before the Forest Hills Commission, Szyk was engaged by Reform Rabbi Hillel Silver at Temple Tifereth Israel in Cleveland to design a series of commemorative stained glass windows for a, quote, war services alcove and a memorial chapel complex honoring congregants who died fighting in World War II. Silver, like Szyk, was an active Zionist, despite the widespread resistance to Zionism by America's reform movement. In the tradition of Zionist art at of the early 20th century, Szyk created large windows with biblical heroes Gideon, Samson, and Judah Maccabee. The names of 22 temple congregants who died in the war were also inscribed in the adjoining Greece chapel on 12 memorial windows that represent the 12 tribes of Israel. When these windows were installed, they were Szyk's largest artworks, but they are essentially enlarged versions of portraits of Jewish heroes Szyk had previously mastered in miniature. During the Cleveland design process, however, Szyk was already engaged in the new, larger, and unusual project for the Forest Hills Jewish Center. Just a few more images of the windows in Cleveland. And take a look at the signs of the tribes, the 12 tribes along the bottom, because some of those motifs will occur in the doors of the ark as well. Despite the ark's large size, however, its design is a collection of fine details like we find in many of Szyk's illustrations. The general source was the rich Eastern European tradition of ornate Baroque arks, especially those of Greater Poland, almost all of which were destroyed in the Holocaust. It is likely that Szyk knew some of these arks firsthand from his life in pre-war Poland, but possibly also from many Polish, Yiddish, and German language publications. Many of these synagogues were photographed by interwar researchers, and George K. Lukomsky published his heavily illustrated Jewish art in European synagogues from the Middle Ages to the 18th century in London in 1947, and Szyk probably had access to this work. The overall ark is designed, organized symmetrically, but each side differs in detail. The ark culminates in a giant crown, seen here, signifying the crown of the good name, held up as the highest of human virtues. It is encrusted with decoration and emblazoned with a pair of griffins. Even today, after the destruction of most Polish synagogues, one can find griffins at the High Synagogue in Krakow, which Szyk might have known from his time studying there. The crown surmounts a large decalogue marked with the first Hebrew letter of each of the 10 Commandments. Prominent on the ark in front of the choir lofts is the paired rampant deer and lion, surrounded by a familiar text from the Pirkei Avot. And it's another view. And then surrounding the ark doors, the surface, there's a larger framing composition awash in decoration with floral details and various Jewish symbols representing Jewish holidays set into irregular frames against a red background. On top are the tablets of the law, which you can see here. Are the tablets of the law for Shavuot, a Seder dish with 4 cups of wine for Pesach, and an etrog and a lulav for Sukkot. Elsewhere we see bread, candles, a Kiddush cup for Shabbat, a Megillah for Purim, Hanukkah lamp. In another section are scales for Yom Kippur, and a shofar for Rosh Hashanah. They're the scales and the shofar, and a Torah scroll for Simchat Torah. Some of these individual motifs are familiar in American synagogues, but the architectural form is not. The design evokes Poland more than any American Jewish past. The ark's bronze doors are surrounded by what at first appeared to be an architectural molding, but is then revealed to be a series of 39 jewels. They're the kind of diamond-shaped or pyramidal extrusions surrounding the ark. They're jewels, each made to represent a book of the Hebrew Bible. And the row of jewels at the top, there are 12 of them, they signify the breastplate worn by the high priest at the temple services in Jerusalem. They represent the 12 tribes, each of which is given its own device. Then on the 2 doors, here you see it open, and then the two doors of the ark. At the bottom of the ark, opening is a relief of two deer, representing, according to Rabbi Buchser, the agility with which we are summoned to serve the Lord. So here are some of the devices in bronze, and they're the deer. So just to conclude, Szyk's work is a rare American example of an ark that stands alone as a work of art, separate from the architecture in which it is set. For the most part, American arks were part of the synagogue architecture, unlike many stained glass windows to which architects often paid little attention. Arks help generate and emphasize the interior design, but they rarely stand out. A lone example, a decade after Szyk, is the so-called this is the little synagogue downstairs, and the same devices on the ark doors are repeated, but in wood, not in bronze. So here's, so a lone example of a standalone ark is the so-called Ark of Revelation in Brith Kodesh in Rochester by sculptor Louise Caish. Few other arks, either in the interwar or post-war periods, can be valued artistically on their own. In the face of the triumph of modernism in the 1950s, retrospectively, we see that Szyk's work marks the end of two traditions for synagogue arks, that of the ornate, Baroque-inspired Jewish architecture of Eastern Europe and the long-preferred historicism and especially classicism employed for ark design in the United States. These are some modern arks, by comparison, Eric Mendelsohn and Percival Goodman. And we end with Szyk's ark. The future of Szyk's great ark in Forest Hills is uncertain, but its importance in this history of Jewish art is assured. Thank you.